Hello and welcome to another daily devotion. As this week we, in our putting our faith into practice, talk about the different ministries of the church. This is week 5, and we're talking about mission and justice. In the Old Testament, if you keep reading the Hebrew Bible, you'll see that there's a phrase that keeps coming around when the Hebrew people are reminded about God to take care of the poor, the orphan, and the widow amongst them, and also the sojourner in their land. Sojourner is a funny way of saying foreigner, or somebody who is in your land who didn't grow up in it, who wasn't native to it. So somebody who's traveling through your land, migrating through your land, whatever their circumstances, the language, the circumstances are all different from the culture they came from. And so to the Hebrew people, God was saying, make sure you take special care for those who are the most vulnerable in your culture. And it got me to thinking about our most vulnerable. And as a ministry, that justice side of the mission and justice ministry is really a voice, an advocacy for those who might not have power or strength on their own. When I was taking a UCC polity class, it's a fancy word of saying how our denomination operates. My minister who was leading the course said, listen, there were Congregationalists and Christians, and then there were the evangelical and Reform side. Both of them cared about serving people and putting their faith into practice in Christian service and charity. But if, for example, somebody like Pharaoh was throwing babies into the river and these babies were drowning, the ENR, or Evangelical Reform side of the United Church of Christ, would say, somebody's got to go out into the water and rescue those babies and make sure that they're cared for. Christian hospitality and service. The ENR side of our church does that so well. But then the Congregationalists and the Christian disciples later would say, hey, there's somebody upriver throwing these children into the water. We've got to find a way to go stop them. And that's really the justice side of ministry, of mission and justice. And it got me to thinking about our church's involvement, not only with the coalition of Immokalee workers, where, farm workers that were working in California were picking grapes for wine that cost $50 an hour, a bottle, and they were getting 2 cents per hour for picking grapes. 2 cents per pound of grapes, and however many pounds they could pick in an hour, but far less than minimum wage. And the growers and the stakeholders were making millions. And it took some people to say, hey, listen, these are the people who are putting the food on our table, but they're not even able to make ends meet, put a roof over their heads and food on their tables. Something's not right here. And that same thread of history continued, whether it was working on the Underground Railroad, which is some of the founding members of our church did, or activity more recently with Native Americans and the Dakota Access Pipeline, and the trip we took up there in 2017 to advocate for those whose water and burial rights were being infringed upon by those who had multiple hundreds of billions behind them in the oil company that sought to run this pipeline that the people of Bismarck didn't want. So, we'll just run it through Indian territory because that's easier and cheaper. Well, if we are to follow Jesus, you'll see this kind of justice work time and time again as he walks with those who have no voice. When, for example, the last thing I'll share, because this devotion is getting long, when Jesus is standing with his disciples and he's telling them in the temple to look at the people who are giving generously of their money, their leftovers. And then he says, look at this widow. She's given more than any. You'll famously remember the widow and the copper mites, Mark chapter 14, I believe. And he says she's given everything she's had. And most people say, she has tremendous faith and trust in God. But it's actually also an indictment, because Jesus has just gotten done shaming the temple priests and the Pharisees and Sadducees by saying, the Pharisees and teachers of the law love to take the places of honors at banquets and in company with others. They love to showboat with their prayers, and yet they devour homes of widows, taking their every last penny, everything they need to survive. And in other words, religion that preys upon the vulnerable and the poor is no religion that God wants anything to do with. So as we think about the justice side, it's not just going to a soup kitchen and serving somebody, that's great, or not just getting coats for somebody in need. It's also walking along with them with laws and social mores that are punitive and keep them in places where they can't make ends meet. They'll always remain poor unless somebody walks with them, speaks on their behalf, and reminds the world that they too are children made in the image of God.